Okay, so we're going to start class with a little review of fixed and variable consumption rates and just kind of think of some different examples for what types of material resources or a situation in which a material resource might have a fixed consumption rate versus a example where there's a variable consumption rate. So the biggest thing to remember is that for a fixed consumption rate, it's going to take the same amount of material resources to complete the task, no matter how long it takes to complete the task. So if the duration is 2 hours or 2 weeks, it's going to be the exact same. And for a variable consumption rate, it's going to depend on how long the task is. So I'm just going to write that in there. Takes the same time or same amount. And for variable, depends on the duration. So one example that I like to give for like a fixed consumption rate, I think I gave filling up a swimming pool. It's going to hold the same amount of water if you have 5 hoses. If you have a fire hose and you can fill it in 2 hours, it's going to take the same amount of water as it's going to take to fill that swimming pool if you're using your garden hose and it takes 6 hours, right? So that's kind of my go-to example for that because it's really easy to visualize. But anything construction related for a fixed consumption rate is also a good kind of concept to think about, like a remodeling job or building a house or something like that is always a good way to think about fixed consumption rates too. Like if I wanted to remodel my bathroom and my husband was going to tile the floor for me, no matter if it takes him 2 hours or a whole weekend, it still is going to be the same amount of tile, right? He's not going to use more tile if it takes him longer because there's only so much square footage in that bathroom, right?
Right.
So that's another example. Can you think of another example of like something that would have a fixed consumption rate?
Um, like carpet.
Sure, carpet. Another one that I think about for this is like the 3 little pigs building their houses. It's like the
Yeah.
same amount of bricks, no matter how long it takes him to build his house. Okay. All right. So those are all good examples of fixed consumption rate. So sometimes it can be harder to think of the variable consumption rate ones. I always add fuel to this list, and we gave the example generator. The example in my video of if that nighttime scene that we are recording for the Dawn Funk music video, if they had to bring a whole bunch of big light banks to the beach to be able to film, obviously there would be some generators that they would have to hook up to in order to run those lights. So depending on how long it took them to shoot that scene, well, if it only takes 2 hours, that's going to be a different amount of fuel for their generators to run the lights than it is if they're shooting for 8 hours, right? They're just going to take more. So fuel is always going to be a variable consumption rate because it depends on how long the task lasts. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Do you have any other examples that you can think of a variable consumption rate?
Would that be like if you rent a car, from a rental place and then you have, the amount of money that you have to pay for the use of the car, but if it would go over, then you would end up paying more?
No, that one wouldn't be because that's kind of like a fee.
Okay.
Um, so And a car rental is not a material resource. So this is for material resources, so things that get used up. So
Okay.
a car rental would be equipment, so that would actually be a work resource. So it has to be
Okay.
something that gets used up, like something that you could hold on to, and then as you're doing the task, it goes away.
Okay, so like nails.
Like in a construction site?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you have 20 people building a house, like a big Amish barn raising, and they can get it done in one day, would you use less nails than if you raised the exact same barn, but it took you 6 days?
No.
No. Nope. So that would be a fixed consumption rate.
Okay.
I know it's tricky to think about. Here's another example. Back to our wedding example. Okay, remember a few weeks ago we were talking about critical path and like if you were holding like a wedding and had a wedding reception, if you have beer at an open bar in Wisconsin.
Okay.
I don't know how appropriate this is. We could make it soda at an open bar. If you had an open bar for 1 hour, there's only so much beer you would go through. But if you had an open bar for 6 hours, you're going to go through more soda because it's a longer duration.
Right. There you go.
So that's just kind of my my other example that I always go to.
It's kind of like a water, like with the Culligan Man that comes with the water jugs. If you only have that water out for, say, a day, you're going to only go through that one. But if you have it out for 3 days, then you're going to go through more than you would for that one day.
Yeah. So, and if you're applying it to like a task in a project, you know, in our Don Funk music video, one of the material resources that we're using is cases of bottled water. So it would be kind of similar to that in that if those backup dancers are rehearsing for 2 hours, they're only going to go through maybe 2 cases or a case of bottled water. But if they're rehearsing for like 6 hours straight that day, well, then they're going to go through more bottled water.
Right.
I think it's tricky because you have to think about the context of the task too. It's not like just knowing what the material resource is. You can figure out whether it's fixed or variable. You have to kind of think about the scenario that you would use it for. I'm going to put for backup dancers. Another one in our Don Funk scenario would be that, what is it called? The dry ice.
Oh, yeah.
So if the task is, you know, shooting scene 2 or whatever, I forget what scene it is, that they need the smoky ambiance of the dry ice. Well, if they're only shooting for 2 hours, they're only going to use so much of it. But if they have to do a whole bunch of retakes, then they still have to keep using it and they still have to, they're going to go through more dry ice. Because it's going to take longer.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think if there's any other examples of a variable consumption rate, something that would depend on how long the task is that you would go through. Maybe trick or treat candy. If you're going to do a very short trick or treat or a very long trick or treat, I was just trying to think of something seasonal for that one. But hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit better idea of what we're talking about with the fixed consumption rate versus the variable consumption rate. Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. It always just depends on how long the task takes. So, anything that, isn't going to change no matter how long it takes is going to be a fixed consumption rate. And then anything that is going to consume more because it's going on for a longer period of time would be a variable consumption rate. Another example would be data on your phone. So if you were going to download one video and you needed, 5 megabytes, well, let's say 5 gigabytes of data in order to do that, that would be a fixed consumption rate because no matter how long it took, you're just downloading the one thing onto your phone. if if you have a really good connection speed, it might only take 2 minutes. If you have a really crappy connection speed, it may take an hour, but you still only need that many gigabytes of data in order to download that one thing. But if you are just streaming Netflix for hours and hours on end, then however much data that you're going to use, it would be variable because you're just continuing to watch more and more videos.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so now that we kind of talked through that, we are going to go to the book on page 122. And is my sound okay? Okay. And we are going to enter a variable consumption rate for a material resource. So here I am in Don Funk Music Video 6M, and we are going to do our handy F5 key. Whoops. Our handy F5 key and go to task number 35. And you can see that this task is in scene 1 and it's the actual video shoot. So when they're actually recording the video for scene 1. And the material resource that we're going to be using for this task is going to be those DVDs that we've already entered into our resource sheet. So for each hour of work, you're only going to be recording for 30 minutes. So if you think about what that might look like in real life, we have to kind of put ourselves like into an imaginary space where we're actually on the scene of the Don Funk music video. And you can imagine like, okay, if shooting the video scene starts at 2 p.m., well, that's just like when everybody shows up to set, right? And then they have to like do makeup touch-ups and things like that. And then the director is eventually going to yell action, and then they're going to actually start recording. So we have to imagine that then the director is going to yell cut at some point. Then they maybe have to reshoot that scene, so everybody has to get back in their original places. Maybe they have to change the lighting around, so there's some wasted time where they're not actually running the cameras. So for every hour of work that we're doing during the video shoot, we're actually only recording for about 30 minutes of that time. So it's just a rough estimate to try to figure out how many DVDs that we are actually going to use. When it says the duration is 2 days, that doesn't mean that the cameras are literally going to be running for 16 hours, right? Because there's other work that has to go into the video shoot, but then those cameras are going to be running about half the time. So we have to go to the resource tab and go to assign resources. And you can see that we already have our bottled water in there. We've got David Barber and Don Funk. We've got Greg. We've got microphones and a sound tech. And then we have these DVDs that are in here. And the units we currently have, if I can open this up a little bit, is 1 2-hour disc for that task. Well, that doesn't make any sense because we're going to be shooting for 2 days for that duration. So it doesn't make sense that we would only be using 1 2-hour disc. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, so we're just going to click the units field here and we're going to type 1/4 of a 2-hour disc per hour. So it's each DVD is a 2-hour disc, and 1/4 of that would be half an hour, 30 minutes. So we're using 30 minutes, which is 1/4 of one of these DVDs per hour. Okay. So that's where that math comes from. And then if we press enter, it'll automatically calculate. So you can see where it has turned it into $40 then, based on the duration of 2 days and our workday being 8 hours and using 1/4 of a 2-hour disc per hour and the cost of $10. So it's doing all that math from us. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So if we click close, our next thing is on page 123 is to go to the task usage view. So this is just a different view, and I don't think we've used it yet. So you're just going to go up to that drop down menu on the left and go down to task usage. And we get this little table here. So what we have on the left-hand side is every task within our project that we have so far. It's taken us right to task 35, but if you scrolled up, you'd have task 34 and so forth. And then it shows the resources that have been assigned to each one of those tasks and gives us some details about, for that particular task, what we're using. And so this is really good to do some budget work and to try to figure out, like, hey, where are we spending the most money? Where can we cut back and things like that? This task usage chart is a really good chart to be, or view, I should say, to be able to use. What's cool about this is for the Scene 1 video shoot, it's already totaled like what our cost is, our estimated cost for this particular shoot, because it's calculating the cost that we're going to pay that sound tech and Greg and David and Don Funk for their time. It's also telling us how much bottled water we think we're going to use, and now that adjusted cost for the DVDs is in there as well. So if we go ahead and double click that DVD right there in our task usage chart, we get this little assignment information dialog box here where we can look in a little bit greater detail as well. So in this general tab, it basically says, okay, here's the resource, here's how much work it's doing, and then here's the units that have been applied to it. And so again, this would be for a variable consumption rate. And then the cost is already calculated in there. So that's just what they're trying to show you in figure 6-2. Okay, so this is a really handy chart, by the way, if you are ever in project and you put all your resources into your resource sheet and then you start doing the assignments. Sometimes you can accidentally check a block as you're doing your task assignments for all of those different resources. So double checking and to make sure like that you only put your resources on the task that you wanted them on. This task usage view, is really handy for that, because you can just kind of look at a glance and be like, oh, Jeff Pike wasn't supposed to be in here. I must have accidentally assigned him here or something like that. So it's a really handy view for that as well. And like I said before, in addition to looking and seeing where you're spending your money. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to enter cost per use for resources. And just as a quick review from our video, this is where if you rent a car or something like that, a lot of times there's your daily rate that you have to pay for the car rental, but then there's like a $50 cleaning fee that you have to pay, whether it's for 2 days or 2 weeks, in addition to that rate. So even though you can do cost per use for material resources, I think it's more common for equipment for a work resource to have a cost per use associated with like a piece of equipment that you're renting. Have you ever had that? Like if you rented a U-Haul or something like that, they give you a daily rate, but then they also have like this additional, shipping and handling type fee. Well, shipping and handling, but like a maintenance fee or something like that they tack on.
Yeah, I think with like a U-Haul, they have like the $19.95 for the day, and then they add on, you have to pay for the gas. You have to have a pull when you bring it back. And then if you go over a certain amount of miles, I think you have to pay more.
Yeah, and sometimes they also have just like a standard like rental fee. Like it's $50 plus your daily rate, So usually when we put in our work resources, we think about the daily rate. Like what do we pay people per hour? What do we pay people per day? Or what do we rent something for per hour or per day? But oftentimes there's just like this extra little fee that goes in there no matter how long you're using it. So I'm back in the Gantt chart view, and we're going to go up to the resource tab here on top, and I am on page 124. Enter a cost per use for a resource. And we are going to go to the resource sheet. So this is where we've entered all of our resources. We're going to go down to the digital truck mounted video cameras. And I say cameras because if you look at our information, we have max units of 200%, which means what?
We have 2 of them.
That's right, we have 2 of them. So if we highlight that and we double click it, or you could go to the information logo up there on the resource ribbon, we can open our resource information dialog box. And we're going to select the costs tab, and you can see that it's just pulling information from the resource sheet. The standard rate is $1,000 a week that we're paying for this digital truck mounted video camera. And this particular item has a $100 maintenance fee every time we use it. So we're just going to enter 100 in the cost per use cost column. And then hit enter. And then it has this cost accrual on the bottom too. This is just for accounting purposes, and you guys might remember this from accounting class. Sometimes costs are basically like billed at the beginning. Sometimes they're billed at the end, and sometimes they're prorated throughout. So you can imagine if it was a longer duration that you were renting this thing, like say a month or something like that, you would want to know, if you were the accountant, when you have to pay that or when those funds have to be available. So that's just what this is for. So we're going to assign the cost accrual for the end. Is that ringing a bell from like accounting class?
I didn't take accounting.
Oh, well then it wouldn't. But it's a thing. Cost accrual is a thing. If it was like prorated, it would be like separate payments. Like that $100 would be spread out throughout that period of time.
Oh, yeah.
So it's just as far as when the payments are due, and whether they're a lump sum at the beginning and the end, or if they're like smaller chunks throughout. So click OK for that. And now you can see that that cost per use column on our resource sheet has the $100 in there. So that is going to drive up our cost every time that we use that digital truck mounted video camera, every time it's assigned to a task. Now that $100 fee that we're paying is going to be worked into those calculations. Okay, so we already did cost per use and fixed and variable consumption rates. So now we're moving on to assigning multiple pay rates for a resource. So this is where the same work resource, usually a person, is going to perform different tasks for different pay rates. And I gave you an example of a graphic designer that gets paid at a graphics designer's rate, but sometimes she fills in as a receptionist and then she only gets paid at the receptionist rate. So we would want a way in project to be able to capture both of those pay rates for the same work resource, which is gonna 9 times out of 10 for this example be a person. Okay, so Yan Lee's rate differs depending on whether he is working on sound production tasks or administrative tasks. So we need to enter a second rate for him. So we need to find Yan Lee, and he is resource number 9. And notice that his standard rate is $18.50 an hour. So we are going to assume that that is his sound production technician rate, that's what he gets paid for. But he also does administrative work, so maybe he's a receptionist or answers phones or something like that for Don Funk Incorporated. And so we're going to go to the resource information window about Yan Lee, and we want to go to the costs tab, and we are going to enter a different pay rate. So if you notice, we've got this little snapshot here of the data that's being pulled in from the resource sheet, but it's actually a series of tabs. So there's the A tab, which is the default, which is his job most of the time. So that we're going to keep the standard rate of his sound technician pay that he gets. But what we want to do is create a separate tab for his administrative pay rate. So we're going to go to B, and now we're just going to fill in $15 an hour there. Whoops. 15-hour. There we go. And then we also want to add in an overtime rate for him for his administrative duties as well. So most people get like time and a half when they work overtime, right? So what this means is if he is assigned to more than 40 hours a week working on administrative tasks, then project will calculate his pay at his overtime rate. So pretty cool. So we're going to put $22.50 an hour in for his overtime rate. And then when we click OK, it's like, oh my gosh, nothing happened because Yanli still has $18.50 an hour here on his standard rate. But that's only because we can't see those additional tabs. So now we have to figure out how we would actually apply this to a particular task. So let's go back to that task usage view, which is just like a really amped up version of a Gantt chart. So we're going to go to the different views menu here, and we're going to go down to task usage. And we are going to go to task 6, which is identify and reserve locations. You can see that Yanli is actually assigned to this task, and his total cost here is $2,114.29. This has been calculated based on his regular pay rate, his tab A, his sound technician pay. But if you look at what the task is, identifying and reserving locations, well, that's not actually a sound technician job. That's more of an administrative job. So we are going to change Yanli's pay rate for this particular task so that it reflects what he should be getting paid for this type of work. Make sense so far?
Yep.
Okay, so if we go ahead and double click Yanli, we're going to get his assignment information dialog box here. And right here in the general tab, if you go to the bottom, it says cost rate table A. So this is where we want to change to his administrative cost rate table and click B. And when we click OK, you'll notice that that change of the total amount that we're paying him for that task has changed. It was $2,000 something, now it's $1,714.29 because it's at that reduced rate for his administrative work. Good?
Yep.
Okay.